Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're trying to cut through some serious noise on a really critical global security issue.
Definitely critical. We're talking about the allegations, the evidence, everything surrounding U.S.-funded biological labs overseas.
Right. And this puts a very sensitive category of weapons of mass destruction, WMDs, squarely on the front page again.
It really does. I mean, the whole biosecurity discussion has sort of been forced into the spotlight because of recent geopolitical events.
So our mission today, for you listening, is to really unpack the source material here. Look at the international concerns, the specific claims and counterclaims, especially those coming out of Russia's military operations in Ukraine.
Yeah, and examine the evidence presented, what's actually out there, and the pretty high-stakes geopolitical fallout from all of this.
It kicked off almost immediately, didn't it? When Russia began its military action in Ukraine, they announced very quickly that they'd found evidence.
That's right. Evidence suggesting U.S.-funded military biological laboratories inside Ukraine.
And this wasn't just some vague rumor. It instantly threw this highly sensitive, kind of long simmering issue into a massive global spotlight.
So let's start with those Russian claims, because they were quite specific. President Putin himself, back in March, talked about this.
What did he say exactly?
He described a network, dozens of labs across Ukraine, and the claim was that all of them were guided, financed by the U.S. Pentagon.
Guided and financed. To do what?
To conduct specific military biological programs. That was the explicit allegation.
And crucially, as you mentioned, Russia didn't just put out a statement, they released documents.
A lot of them. Batches of what they claimed were original documents posted online.
And these had details.
Oh, yeah. Project names, codes, specific funding amounts, even things like official seals, signatures, names of institutions, personnel involved. I mean, if you're talking evidence, they provided volume and a surprising level of detail.
And some of those project details were, frankly, alarming. The sources mentioned Project UP2.
Yes, UP2, allegedly involving research on anthrax, Bacillus anthracis.
Anthrax. Okay.
And according to the documents, this included drug testing conducted on Ukrainian soldiers.
Right, that part is deeply concerning. What else?
There was Project UP4. This one apparently focused on highly pathogenic viruses like H5N1 influenza, that's bird flu, and Newcastle disease virus.
Then there was Project 9. This one dealt with African swine fever, ASF. Now, most people hear swine fever, they think pigs, agriculture. How does that fit into a military biological context?
Well, that's a really insightful question, and it points to something critics often highlight. ASF isn't usually seen as a direct threat to human soldiers.
So what's the angle?
It's often cited as a potential tool for economic biowarfare.
Economic biowarfare, meaning?
Meaning the goal isn't necessarily killing people directly, but crippling a nation's food supply, devastating its agricultural economy. That can cause widespread instability.
And the fact that ASF outbreaks were already happening in that region.
Exactly. For years, actually. So the timing of research on ASF pathogens funded through these programs looked suspicious to some observers. It raised questions.
Okay, so you have these detailed, documented claims coming from Russia. What was the official U.S. response?
It was pretty much a blanket denial.
Just, nope, not true.
Pretty much. The White House press secretary called it Russian fabrication, disinformation, and even went further, suggesting Russia itself might be planning to use bioweapons in a kind of false flag operation.
Wow. Okay. And at the UN?
Similar message. The U.S. representative at the UN Security Council stated clearly, no U.S. bioweapons in Ukraine, called the whole thing disinformation again.
But this is where things get tricky, right? The transparency issues around the U.S. position.
They certainly emerge here, yes.
Like, why did the Ukrainian health ministry issue an urgent order on February 24th, the very day the military operations began to destroy all biological pathogens in their labs?
That timing is definitely noteworthy. It suggests, a real urgency, maybe a fear of what might be discovered if those labs were captured.
It does seem rushed.
And then you have the testimony from U.S. Undersecretary of State Victoria Nuland. This was in front of Congress in March.
What did she say?
Well, she did confirm the existence of biological research facilities in Ukraine. She also expressed grave concern about them potentially falling into Russian hands.
So she confirmed they exist?
Yes, but her description of what they were doing, their purpose. Observers, critics mostly, described her responses as hesitant or evasive. It didn't seem entirely forthcoming to some.
And I think globally, the big question mark hangs over those documents Russia released, the ones with the codes, the signatures, all that detail.
Right. The U.S. failure to specifically refute those documents, item by item almost. If they're all just crude forgeries, why not point out the errors? Show the proof.
Instead of doing that was the explanation.
Instead of engaging directly with those specific documents, the official line from the U.S. Department of Defense focused on something called the DTRA program.
DTRA?
The Defense Threat Reduction Agency. Their explanation was that the work in Ukraine was strictly defensive.
Defensive how?
Aimed at destroying unsafe biological materials left over from the old Soviet Union, from the Cold War era, just cleaning up legacy threats.
Okay, a cleanup operation. But then the timeline issue comes up, doesn't it?
It does. Voices even within the U.S. media, like Fox News host Tucker Carlson at the time, pointed this out. This program started way back in 2005.
2005. So that's 17 years.
17 years. So the question became, why does it take 17 years with significant funding just to clean up old materials? It made people wonder if the actual purpose, the actual scope, was perhaps broader than just disposal.
And that lack of, let's say, immediate clear answers about Ukraine becomes maybe more concerning when you realize this isn't just about Ukraine, is it?
Not at all. If you zoom out, the U.S. presence in this area is, well, it's massive. We're talking about 336 biolabs globally.
336.
Yes, distributed across 49 different countries and regions.
Wow. That's a very deep structure. And the history of these overseas labs goes back even further than the Cold War cleanup idea, right?
It does. Quite a bit further. U.S. activity with overseas labs started as early as 1898. Initially, it was about supporting colonial activities, believe it or not, long before modern bioweapons were even conceived.
1898, so pre-World War I even.
Right. Then it expanded significantly after World War II, mainly for military health support, supporting troops deployed abroad. So yeah, it's a massive, long-standing global footprint.
I remember the U.S. policy shift under Nixon back in '69, the decision to destroy offensive bioweapons but keep doing defensive research.
Correct. That led eventually to the Biological Weapons Convention, the BWC.
But the BWC is often described as, well, weak. Why is that? What's the fundamental problem?
The fundamental problem, the key structural weakness, is that it has no teeth for verification. There's no mechanism built in to actually check if countries are complying.
No way to inspect or verify claims.
Essentially, no. And this isn't just an oversight. It's a specific clause, a verification protocol that the United States has historically and quite consistently prevented from being added to the treaty.
Okay, wait. Why would the U.S. block verification for a treaty banning bioweapons? What's the strategic thinking there?
Well, the effect is that it creates a huge trust deficit globally. Think about it. The U.S. is the only country officially still possessing chemical weapons stockpiles.
Right.
And it's also the only nation consistently blocking the creation of a multilateral verification system for the BWC.
So it looks like demanding checks on others while refusing to be checked itself.
That's exactly how it's perceived by many countries, and that perception naturally fuels global suspicion, especially when you consider the history.
And that history isn't clean, is it? The sources mentioned the U.S. using chemical and biological agents before. Korea, Vietnam.
Yes, and the Agent Orange example from the Vietnam War is particularly critical here.
Why Agent Orange specifically?
Well, first, the sheer scale, over 70 million gallons of this toxic defoliant were sprayed. But more importantly for this discussion, it's the legacy.
With long-term effects.
Exactly. Widespread environmental damage, yes, crop failure, water pollution, but also severe generational health problems, horrific birth defects that continue for decades.
And the victims.
To this day, the U.S. has not compensated those Vietnamese victims. And that history of invisible, devastating, long-lasting, uncompensated harm from chemical biological agents, that's precisely the fear critics have about current opaque biological research programs. Could something like that happen again?
And it's not just historical actions abroad. There have been significant safety issues domestically too, right?
Absolutely. The sources point to major safety failures. For instance, between 2004 and 2015, a U.S. military lab in Utah mistakenly shipped out 86 samples of viable anthrax.
Viable, meaning live anthrax.
Yes, live anthrax that they thought had been deactivated, made harmless.
Where did these samples go?
To labs across 50 U.S. states and also to 8 or 9 foreign countries. A massive, dangerous mistake.
That's terrifying.
And then there's Fort Detrick, often called the sort of epicenter for U.S. military biological research.
What happened there?
It was suddenly shut down, ordered to cease research in 2019 due to regulatory violations, safety breaches.
And the details.
Withheld, citing national security concerns. So you see this pattern: systemic safety failures, lack of transparency, accidents. It all contributes directly to the high level of global suspicion we see today.
So when we look at that map of 336 labs worldwide, are their locations strategic? Is there a pattern?
Oh, definitely. Analysis highlighted in the sources shows the locations aren't random at all. They correlate very closely with major U.S. military activities and bases.
And how has that pattern changed over time?
Well, after the Cold War ended, the focus shifted, quite deliberately it seems, towards former Soviet republics.
Like Ukraine.
Like Ukraine, Georgia, Kazakhstan, and also regions right next door to major powers the U.S. sees as rivals, like China and Russia. It's a clear geopolitical pattern.
It sounds like a strategy of maybe biological containment, or at least strategic presence right on their borders.
That's certainly how it's interpreted by some. And one of the most high-stakes concerns raised, particularly by Chinese experts mentioned in the sources, is that these labs, positioned right around major powers, could potentially be rapidly activated as forward bases for biological attacks in a conflict.
Forward bases for attack. That's a serious escalation of the potential threat.
It gets even more specific and, frankly, more disturbing. There are documented concerns, particularly from Chinese and Russian sources, that some U.S. research might involve collecting biological information specifically targeting, say, the Slavic race.
Targeting a specific ethnicity. How would that even work?
The idea, the fear, is developing pathogens or agents that might disproportionately affect certain genetic groups. This raises a whole new category of threat, potentially even more insidious than nuclear weapons, because the harm could be slow, invisible, and aimed at a specific population.
That is a staggering claim. It fundamentally changes the risk calculation from just widespread destruction to something much more targeted, almost invisible.
It absolutely does. And if you connect this to the bigger picture, the intersection of military technology and private industry, the sources suggest we might be seeing the rapid formation of a biomilitary industrial complex.
Like the military-industrial complex Eisenhower warned about, but for biology.
Exactly. Building on those historical links between the U.S. military and big pharmaceutical or biotech companies. But there's a new twist.
What's the twist?
Something really novel and maybe the most compelling or perhaps disturbing insight from those Ukraine documents was evidence linking infectious disease probability to capital markets.
Wait, linking disease outbreaks to the stock market? How?
Apparently, systems were being explored or developed that would allow investors to actually place bets, like stock market bets, on the likelihood of disease outbreaks occurring.
You're saying people could profit financially from predicting or maybe even influencing outbreaks?
That's the implication. You're effectively introducing a direct financial profit motive into this already opaque military tech platform that deals in global biological risks.
Wow.
That fundamentally changes the game, changes how we have to assess the potential dangers of these labs.
That's deeply unsettling. Despite all this secrecy, though, the issue did burst into the mainstream, didn't it? Partly because of U.S. domestic politics.
Yeah, that's a fascinating counterbalancing force. Partisan fighting within the U.S., specifically opposition to the Biden administration, actually seized on the Russian claims.
How so?
They highlighted aspects like Hunter Biden's investment fund having some connection, however indirect, to companies involved in some of these lab projects. That connection was used to force the issue into wider public discussion.
So internal politics kind of blew the lid off. To some extent.
To some extent, yes. It meant the issue couldn't just be contained behind official denials or national security classifications anymore. You saw figures like former Representative Tulsi Gabbard.
I remember her video.
Exactly, putting out videos calling for the global closure of all such labs. And she faced intense backlash for it, accusations of spreading treasonous lies. But the point is, internal political friction made it impossible to keep the gravity of the situation completely hidden.
Okay, so if this biomilitary complex is growing, potentially with finance involved, what actually acts as a restraint? What pushes back?
Well, the BWC, the Biological Weapons Convention, weak as it is, still imposes some institutional restraints. There are norms against these weapons.
Okay, international norms. What else?
Crucially, I think, the rise of other powerful nations. We live in a more multipolar world now. That provides a counterbalance to potential U.S. unilateralism.
Other countries pushing back?
Yes. China, for example, has formally demanded full clarification from the U.S. about its military biological activities, and they've explicitly called for the U.S. to accept multilateral verification. That's significant diplomatic pressure.
And domestic.
As we just discussed, internal social pressure and domestic political opposition can also act as a check, however imperfectly, on potentially unchecked military or quasi-military actions. #outro.
Right. So to kind of synthesize everything we've discussed today for you, the listener,
Yeah,
this is clearly an issue defined by, well, complexity and immense risk,
definitely. You have concrete, very detailed evidence presented by one side, Russia.
met with strong, almost blanket denials from the other side, the U.S.
And this whole dispute plays out against a really troubling historical backdrop. There's systemic non-transparency, specific past incidents like Agent Orange where harm occurred without compensation.
And just the sheer scale of it all.
Yeah.
336 labs around the world. The potential risk is enormous.
I think the consensus among critics looking at the sources from around the world is pretty clear on one thing. The U.S. military biological activities, certainly in Ukraine, but likely elsewhere too, seem to have gone far beyond just basic public health needs.
So the call is for
Dramatically greater transparency and openness. It boils down to trust. If a major global power appears unwilling to be verified, unwilling to be checked when it comes to potential WMD development, it fundamentally destabilizes global security and trust.
So let's leave you with this thought. We know about the long, damaging, and uncompensated history of past biological and chemical warfare efforts, things like Agent Orange. We know there's a systemic lack of verification for bioweapons treaties today. Given all that, what must global society really prioritize right now to ensure that defensive biological research actually is defensive, not just in name, but truly in action?
Because the long-term threat to global safety that comes from this kind of opacity, especially, as we discussed, when powerful financial motives might be getting mixed in, that opacity itself is the danger that perhaps demands the most urgent global attention and action.